I think it's a strange vanity that makes us think we're the only ones in the solar system.
Epsa-fragging Lathe, damn it.
Hi, welcome back to my channel. Again, thanks to the subscribers that are kind of encouraging me to do these things, and thanks for the comments on the videos. It's really good to talk to people, and obviously that's why we're doing this, and it's a lot of fun, but it's nice to get that interaction, which is really cool. So please make comments if you fancy it. Today's video is a video I've been wanting to do for a while, and I thought I was kind of in the right mood to do it. It kind of stems from mostly a really good friend of mine a few years ago telling me that they thought that science fiction was a bit of fluff, didn't have a lot of meat on the bones, wasn't very deep, and I think they just had Star Wars in their head. I'm not sure, but it was they just thought it was a little bit fun, kind of like they kind of related it to action-related things, I think. So that's always kind of bugged me a little bit, because clearly science fiction is very, very complex and has lots of different layers and lots of different subgenres. So I wanted to do a video on the subgenres and the different categories in science fiction. So I'm going to cover 16 different categories, and I mean, one of them, well, a couple of them you could argue aren't categories necessarily, but could be called tropes. But I'm going to break it into 16 different sections anyway, and what I'm going to do is talk about what I think you can get out of those categories or subgenres, and then I'm going to give an example of a book that I'd recommend that I really love from that particular category. So, the categories of science fiction.
One impossible thing at a time.
So I'm going to start off with a video that's based around the category of alien invasion. So I think it's a good way to start, because I think there's a lot of ways that people relate to science fiction. So it's kind of an obvious one, and clearly a really popular one in films. But in novels, I think it's quite different, and you can get different types of alien invasion and stuff. And I've found that sometimes it can be really deep, and I'd say one of my favourite examples of this, absolutely by a mile to be fair, is Jack Finney's The Body Snatchers. So this is a different kind of invasion, so this is not like a huge spaceship appearing in the sky and taking over everything. It's not like an invasion like War of the Worlds or something, but I think it's much more subtle, much more interesting, and infamously is reflecting on the paranoia in the 50s in America, and that whole idea of the Reds under the bed and all that kind of thing. And it's beautifully written. I think it's a fantastic book, and I think it's a really good example of alien invasions. Okay, time travel. I've already done one video on time travel. I'm kind of preparing another one, and it's really interesting finding all these other books about time travel, and I know there's a few absolute classics that I haven't read yet that I'm reading for this new video, but there's loads out there. But this is the one I'm picking as a really good example of time travel. The thing with time travel, I think, is that I think they're really successful when they go into the past. There's a couple of examples when they go into the future. So famously, H.G. Wells' Time Machine goes into the future and then goes into the future again. And most time travel books go into the past, and this book goes back to the Black Death. And what I find is really interesting is the way that the author, Connie WIllis, creates a really intense and evocative atmosphere in the book. It's a big chunky book, but I love the way it's written, and it made me want to read more of hers. She did do another book called To Say Nothing of the Dog, which I've got over there somewhere, which is a follow-up. So I think it's the same group of historians going back in time. I gather it's slightly more humorous than this one. But yeah, this is quite serious and quite intense, but I think it's a really good example of time travel, and it's such a great science fiction category. So many great time travel books out there, and obviously a lot of people are familiar with time travel anyway through Terminator films, and in general film and TV has done time travel a lot, but there's tons of great books out there on the time travel theme. Okay, so dystopian novels are really interesting and clearly very academic and political. It's a category that is clearly very deep and certainly couldn't be accused of being fluffy and light and silly like I was talking about in the early part of the video. So loads of great dystopian books out there, and I just wanted to highlight this one, We, by Zamyatin. The main character of the book does absolutely believe in the state they're living in. So it's a society called One State, where they don't have any choice. They have certain blocks of time where they can have some freedom, but it's all very state-led. And the main character, because it's written in the first person as well, the main character absolutely believes in it, and slowly through the course of the book they start to doubt it and get involved in a rebellion. It's really well written, it's really nice, really interesting, fascinating book. And it's also extra interesting, I think, because it's the inspiration behind 1984. So yeah, if you can get hold of this, it's now still sold in most bookshops, I think. So it's quite easy to get hold of. So yeah, We by Zamyatin, fantastic Russian classic. So another really, really famous, popular, quite rightly celebrated area of science fiction is the post-apocalyptic genre. And there's loads and loads of post-apocalyptic books, and there's more coming out all the time. So I think that genre has got more popular, that subgenre has got more popular as time's gone on. But I think an absolutely brilliant example of this is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. It's such a great book. The character work is fantastic. You really do get a sense of this society that's broken down, and this group of actors are trying to live through this and having these encounters that sort of challenge them, and some of it's quite brutal sometimes. It's really tense sometimes. It's set in a world that's not really recovered from a virus that's wiped out a huge area of the population, and basically the few that are remaining are trying to live through it. It's set in 2 times as well, so there's sections of the book that are set before it happens, and sections of the book, or a lot of the book, after it happened, and how this absolute collapse of society has affected this group of actors that are trying to keep going and trying to keep art alive. So it's a really, really interesting take on it. It's very celebrated, but you may have heard of the book before, but I think it's a great example of the post-apocalyptic genre. First Contact. First Contact, again, the thing with that genre, authors can explore how we deal with that kind of philosophical, religious, political change, where the carpet's swept from under us and we have to rethink everything. I think that's what a lot of First Contact can bring. But in the case of the book I'm going to show as the example, I like the fact that this book goes well beyond our First Contact, goes well beyond this present day, and it's just epic in scale. So epic in time and epic in the kind of species they're talking about. And this is Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I'm calling it a First Contact book because ultimately what's happening through the book is, you know, that it's building towards a confrontation between 2 species, and that is the kind of clash that results from the First Contact, and the fact that both of them think they deserve to live on this particular planet. It's such a great book. I did a longer video where I talked about this book. It is generally loved by anyone that talks about it, really, but it's such a great book, and it made me want to read everything that I can by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I've read a few now, but this book is definitely his best, I think, so far. But it does span lots and lots of centuries, lots of expanse of space, and it does have this entire evolution of a species and how that results in their ownership of a planet and how they build up their society. So it's really, really interesting. It does cover lots of different elements of science fiction, but it has that First Contact element that I think is fascinating as well, which is sort of what it's building up to. So yeah, Children of Time, phenomenal book. That's my example for First Contact. Space opera. Okay, space opera is usually pretty epic, and you might have space opera that is a series of books like the Expanse books there, and you might get space opera that covers political intrigue, political conflict in a particular star system or something like that, or certain species battling it out. So like on TV, you've got a great example of that with Babylon 5, and Star Trek has got lots of space opera elements to it. But this book I'm going to put up as my example for space opera because I think it's got that kind of expanse in it, but it's also first part of a trilogy, but it's a standalone book as well. It works as a standalone book. I just thought it was a lot of fun, and I don't think people talk about it much. There's Drew Williams' The Stars Now Unclaimed. I really like this book. I really enjoyed it, and it's quite light, but it's got a nice character work in it, and there is this sort of epic thing it's building up to. Yeah, and the scale of it is based around this sort of central premise that there was this huge pulse that went across the galaxies and destroyed technology. It was an attempt by a certain group of people that you don't find out straight away to create peace across the galaxies. It went wrong, and it sent all these different planets backwards in scientific discovery, and were basically sent back to the Stone Age. So within that, you had these other elements that were trying to recover that, trying to find out how the pulse happened, and it's all based around. The first book is based around this girl that could be a key to the problem, and it's just really interesting. And as I said, it's a nice example of space opera. Okay, this next one is probably more of a trope than a subgenre or category, but I wanted to include it because I think it's quite a big trope. It's something that's really common, and it didn't really fit into the others, I didn't think, as well. And that's the mad scientist. So obviously, the first ever science fiction book was a mad scientist book, Frankenstein. But I wanted to include H.G. Wells' incredible book, The Island of Dr. Moreau. So I love this book. He writes with such a lovely sense of wonder because of the time it was written and his own love of what he was talking about and the way that he had his own sense of wonder with what he wanted to write about. It comes through in the prose, and I think that really kind of draws you in. And this is obviously a classic example of if you could do it, should you do it? And I think that's what really the mad scientist thing is about, is exploring the fact that sometimes we do things in our scientific progress that you have to question, why are we doing this, and should we do it, and is it making society worse or better? And that's what a lot of this is about. The Island of Dr. Moreau definitely explores that idea of does scientific exploration always do what's best, or does it do it just because it can? So yeah, have a look at that if you haven't read it yet. H.G. Wells, The Island of Dr. Moreau. Another subcategory that people don't really talk about a lot, but I think it's an interesting thing that I'm going to do a special video on this at some point soon, and that's biological science fiction. A lot of science fiction is based around physics, or about space, or the future, time travel, those kind of things, or dystopia, that kind of thing. But there are some that are based around some kind of what if that is focused on biology. So it could be plants, it could be animals, it could be something that's changed in us, in our bodies, those kind of books. And I just think this book is one of the greatest books ever written. That's The Day of the Triffids. It's not massively scientific because it's clearly quite far-fetched, but the central premise that there are these Triffids that are deadly to people and end up sort of taking over kind of thing, that is all mixed in with the idea that most of the population are blind as well, thanks to the solar rays that were happening in this huge meteorological event that everybody watched except a few people. And these two things are combined to make this compelling story that is basically an excuse to explore how humans would react to that, how society would react to these two situations. And some of it's really brutal, some of it's really reflecting on the nasty side of our personality. But there's a bit of hope in there, and there's a really cool ending. It's just a great book. And if you haven't read it yet, you really should. Day of the Triffids, really good example of that biological science fiction. Okay, so there's a really massively popular area of science fiction that I don't really go into that much, which is military science fiction. So probably the most famous example, I reckon, is probably Starship Troopers, Robert Heinlein. But I haven't read that yet. I've got it to read, haven't read it yet. But I have read this, which I think is an awesome book, Old Man's War. So John Scalzi, I think, is a really interesting, easy-to-read author that explores some nice ideas in a very accessible, commercial way. And There was a few books of his that I was kind of reflecting on, possibly including in this video. But Old Man's War is a really good example of that military sci-fi thing, and it's that idea that people can be, if they're really old, they can put their brains into younger bodies to fight in an interstellar war. And it explores the idea of age and of relationships within that premise of starting again. And it's got a sort of a, can war be questionable, why are you fighting, and those kind of questions are in there as well, which I think any military science fiction book should have. There should be some sort of discussion about war in there. So there is that in this book. And Old Man's War, I couldn't find my version of Forever War, to be honest. I wanted to use that, but I can't find it. But yeah, Old Man's War, John Scalzi, is a great book. Okay, so pulp science fiction. Pulp science fiction is just a bit of fun. It's the stuff that doesn't really take the science that seriously. It has a science fiction element, so it could be set in space, it could be about astronauts, it could be about heroic people on Mars doing things. It could have that sort of fantastical element. A lot of pulp science fiction was written before a lot of scientific discoveries were made in the middle of the 20th century that changed our understanding of that kind of thing. So this was written in the 60s, and it's just a lot of fun. It's a very light-hearted book, but it's a really good example of pulp science fiction, just literally there for a bit of fun. Stainless Steel Rat, Harry Harrison. Not very deep, not very serious, completely reflecting that idea that my friend said that science fiction is just a bit of fun. In this example, yes, it is, but clearly that not all science fiction is like this. But I think it's a really good example of that sort of fun, comedic, light-hearted. It's kind of a criminal that ends up switching and trying to work for an interplanetary police system. But yeah, Stainless Steel Rat, it's a lot of fun. AI, artificial intelligence. Okay, so clearly it's a huge area of fiction, and loads of books on it, and I do want to do a little special one about that as well. But the one I'm picking for this is a story from Exhalation, which I've talked about a few times. I love this book so much. The Life Cycle of Software Objects. If you get a chance to read The Life Cycle of Software Objects, I mean, just nip into a bookshop and just read it. It's not that long. It's such an amazing story. The Life Cycle of Software Objects. And it's the idea that you've got robots that are supposedly meant to be pets. They've been created to be pets, and then due to a lack of funding with this company that makes them, things start going wrong with the company, and there's this question of what do you do with them? Do they have feelings? Do they have emotions? If they do, how do you treat them? And then there's an offer to resell them as something else, and you've got this sort of moral dilemma basically about how you treat these robotic pets. And it's such a great story, and it makes you think, like most of the stories in this book does. So yeah, just buy Exhalation anyway. And his other book, which is the where is it? Stories of Your Life, is also amazing with some great ideas in it, and a great First Contact story as well, which was what Arrival, the film, was based on. So yeah, just chuck these out there, that these two books are amazing. I've already said it in another video, but they really are amazing. But yeah, The Life Cycle of Software Objects, have a look at that. Amazing story. And that's a really nice example of how science fiction looks at artificial intelligence and the moral dilemmas that could come from a real concrete development in their intelligence. Science fantasy. Science fantasy covers the kind of literature or films or TV that doesn't really take science that seriously, but does have a serious element to it. So there's loads and loads of different versions of this. Dune's a really good example, and also you can go the other way, and a film that was hugely influenced by Dune, Star Wars, is definitely science fantasy as well. So that's clearly a lot of fun. Dune's much more serious and has that sort of political edge to it as well. But I'm going to pick a book that is by Ursula Le Guin. Her stuff's amazing, and this is The Lathe of Heaven. George Orr, the main character in this book, can change the world with his dreams. So clearly that's not enormously scientific, but Ursula Le Guin, as with all her books, explores the premise so that she can look at human behaviour, so greed, selfishness, compassion, selflessness, those kind of things explored in this book. And that, you know, basically it's like a 3 wishes kind of setup, but through this guy's dreams, through George Orwell's dreams, and the psychiatrist that he's speaking to about this issue he's got with his dreams ends up betraying him and doing all sorts of things that complicate the whole plot and complicate the situation. So, yeah, read it. It's not very long. It's a great book. It's one of the best, I think, but it's clearly science fantasy because it's about dreams changing the world. Okay, the superhero genre, subgenre, category, trope. The superhero science fiction world is clearly dominated in our minds with Marvel and DC Comics, that whole comic thing, and it doesn't happen as much in literature, I think. It's certainly not the main bulk of science fiction literature, but it's there. And this series, I think, is a lot of fun. It's quite funny. It's very action-packed. It's very light. Peter Cline's X-Hero series. So I've read 3 so far. I'm about to read the 4th one soon, and it's basically reads like a comic book. I mean, it's not a comic book. It's prose, but it's got that kind of atmosphere, that kind of light of touch thing with the more commercial, fluffy comics, I guess, because there are clearly very serious comics, but you know what I'm getting at. But the premise of this series is that these superheroes have to fight against a zombie apocalypse. So it's superheroes against zombies. So if you love zombies and you love superheroes, then put them in a sandwich. And then you got the X-Hero series. It's a lot of fun. So I'm using this as my example of good superhero stuff. A subgenre we see all the time in films and TV, but you do get it in books sometimes, and literature, obviously, besides comics, but you do get it in prose literature as well. Parallel worlds. Parallel worlds is kind of a relatively newer subgenre, I think, of science fiction. And this gives me a nice excuse to talk about one of the best books I've ever read. A book that I think, in general, everyone loves. I haven't seen anyone slag this one off. Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. Don't find out too much, because the less you know, the better. But it really is an incredible book. It's just beautifully written. You can tell that he writes screenplays because it's got a lot of pace to it. It's got enough character work and background that it's not like really superficial, but it doesn't dwell too long on those kind of things, and gives you enough so you feel like it's quite deep but has a lot of pace. And it's just a great book, and it's quite a thriller. You know, it does keep you wondering what's going to happen next, and the ending is brilliant. It's just a great book. So yeah, this does play around with the idea of parallel worlds, but I'm not going to say any more than that because it will spoil it hugely. Hopefully I haven't spoiled it already. Dark Matter, Blake Crouch. Read it. Okay, so Cyberpunk is a little bit different for me. I haven't read a lot of Cyberpunk. I haven't read Neuromancer or anything like that. So I did struggle to find a good example that I thought was justified that I owned. But I do think it's quite cool that I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison has been described as cyberpunk. This is a huge collection, the Essential Ellison. There's 2 versions of it. I've got this one, and this is the 35-year retrospective, and I've got the 50-year retrospective as well downstairs. It's such a great bit. I would recommend you had this anyway, but because it's his most famous story, it's in this collection, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and it's a great example of dystopia as well, because it's far in the future, and basically the last remaining humans are being tortured, trapped by a super intelligent computer that seems to be getting its kicks from torturing them. And it's quite a nasty, brutal, intense, full-on story. But you know, it is Harlan Ellison, so you're going to get some. It's not going to be an easy ride necessarily. But yeah, it's really, really good example of cyberpunk before they gave it a name, really. So yeah, that's my example for that. But like I said, I need to read more cyberpunk if I'm going to be showing newer versions of that. And then just to finish off, comedy science fiction. So comedy science fiction doesn't tend to delve too much into deep psychological themes. or political intrigue or anything like that. It's usually just to make you laugh. So nothing wrong with that. And you know, hopefully this video is showing you how multifaceted science fiction is. But this book, if you do want to laugh, this is a really funny book. We'll Save the Galaxy for Food by Yahtzee Croshaw. Yeah, it's about a kind of a chancer pilot, adventurer guy who basically pretends to be somebody else called Jack McEwen, and that guy, pretending to be that guy, leads him into a whole deal with political corruption and sets him off on this adventure that means he's got to save the galaxy. And there's a lot of funny dialogue in it. There's a lot of sarcasm from his companion robot. It's really good, really funny, and definitely recommend it. I think it's unusual to find a book that's this funny in the science fiction world, so it's worth celebrating that, I think. So yeah, comedy science fiction. There's not a lot of them around, but they're awesome. So that is 16. I think that's 16. Yeah, that's 16 subgenres or categories of science fiction. Arguably, a couple of them could be tropes, like The Mad Scientist, but that's a really nice overview, I think, of what science fiction can do. And clearly it can get very serious, very deep, very psychological, very political, very philosophical, but it can be a lot of fun as well, and actually ignore all those things and just want to make you laugh. So science fiction is awesome. There we go. That's the basic conclusion. So go ahead and read those books. They're awesome. Thanks a lot for watching, and please subscribe to the channel if you think I'm going to do some good stuff. And thanks again for all the people that have already subscribed. Bye.
Paint me a picture of what it's like to be